All right, so have you ever really, looked at a construction contract?
Yeah.
There are pages and pages of just, the most dense language,
Oh, yeah.
legalese,
Yeah. Absolutely.
all designed to make sure everyone knows exactly where they stand. But you know what happens when things don't go according to plan. Today, we are looking at a case where a listener sent us an example.
Okay.
A recent court case that gets into what it means to formally hand over rights and responsibilities in a contract.
That's right. You've shared the judgment from the England and Wales High Court, specifically their Technology and Construction Court.
Okay.
And this is in the case of Grove Construction, London, Ltd v. Bagshot Manor, Ltd.
Right.
And it was decided in 2025, so it's pretty recent. It's a fantastic illustration of how the legal system interprets these agreements, these very formal agreements.
Yeah.
And it shows where things can get tricky when those formal lines are tested.
And the core of this dispute boils down to a pretty fundamental question. Can you transfer the good parts of a contract?
Right.
Like, say, the right to receive payments.
Right.
Without taking on the less appealing parts.
Yeah.
Like the obligations to make payments or, deal with any problems that pop up. And can you separate those things?
Yeah.
And if you can, what does it mean for legal action, like going to adjudication?
Precisely.
Okay.
This case really turns on that distinction between assigning benefits and assuming burdens formally. The judgment itself lays out all the details, the arguments from both sides, and the court's reasoning in reaching its decision. It's a great way to see these abstract legal principles play out in the real world. The very real and formal world of construction.
Formal.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the details of who was involved.
Okay, yeah.
We've got Grove Construction, London Limited.
Right.
They're the construction company. They did the work. And in this case, they're making a formal claim.
Right. Yeah.
And then we have Bagshot Manor Limited.
Yep.
Who are the defendants?
Right.
So what were their original roles in all of this?
So the arrangement started with Grove Construction being hired by a different company called Bagshot Manor Developments Limited, or BMDL for short.
Okay.
BMDL contracted with Grove Construction to design and construct some residential buildings. It was at a place called Bagshot Manor, and this original construction contract was signed back on April 20th, 2020.
So Grove Construction does the work.
Right.
It reaches practical completion.
Yeah.
So that means the main construction's finished.
That's right. Yeah.
Around February 2022.
Yeah.
And then there's this retention period.
Right.
And for listeners who might not be familiar, that's a percentage of the payment.
Yeah.
That's held back until any potential problems or defects are resolved.
That's right.
So that period ended in February 2023. So after that, Grove Construction wants to claim the money that was held back.
Exactly.
And
they're claiming what they believe they're owed under the contract.
Right.
But here's where things get a little complicated. BMDL, the company that originally hired Grove Construction, ran into some money problems, and they entered administration. Then, on July 21st, 2023, BMDL entered into a deed of assignment with Bagshot Manor Limited, the company that's the defendant in this case.
And this deed of assignment, that sounds very formal, very significant legally.
Right.
What did it cover exactly?
Yeah.
The judgment mentions it was titled Assignment of Construction Documents for Bagshot Manor.
Yeah, that's right.
That sounds pretty broad.
Yeah, it does sound broad.
Okay.
The title might suggest a comprehensive transfer.
Right.
But the specific wording within the deed is important here.
Okay.
So the assigned documents, as listed in the schedule attached to the deed, included the original construction contract between Grove Construction and BMDL.
Right.
So it appeared as though that original contract was being transferred to Bagshot Manor Limited.
Okay, so let's focus on the deed itself. The judgment highlights a couple of specific clauses.
Right.
Clause 3 seems particularly important. It talks about the assignment of whatever right, title, and interest, if any, the assigner has in the construction documents, together with all rights of action arising under them, to the assignee, to the extent in both cases such are assignable. So what's the key takeaway from that clause?
The key takeaway there is the focus on right, title, and interest and the rights of action.
Okay.
That BMDL, the assignor, actually held. The clause states that these rights and interests are being transferred to Bagshot Manor Limited, the assignee.
Okay.
And it's also important to note that the consideration, what Bagshot Manor paid for this transfer, was a nominal sum, just £1.
£1.
Yeah.
Wow. That really underscores the almost symbolic nature of this transaction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The judgment also mentions Clause 4 of this deed. What did that stipulate?
Clause 4 dealt with the process of giving written notice of this assignment to all the parties involved, which of course included Grove Construction. It stated that notice should be given as soon as possible, within 10 days of the assignment date.
Okay.
With a certified copy also being sent to BMDL.
Right.
However, this notification was actually delayed.
Okay.
It didn't happen until February 2024.
Wow.
And the full unredacted deed was only provided to Grove Construction just before the court hearing.
Interesting. So there's this legal process of assignment, but the communication of that assignment didn't follow the timeline.
Yeah, that's right.
So after this assignment had supposedly taken place, Grove Construction tried to get the money that they felt they were due.
Yeah.
Who did they pursue for this payment?
They pursued Bagshot Manor Limited,
Okay.
the company that had received the assignment.
Mm-hmm.
From their perspective, it was a logical step. They believed that since Bagshot Manor Limited now held the rights, they were responsible for the payment.
Makes sense.
However, Bagshot Manor Limited refused to pay.
Which led to adjudication. Tell us about those attempts to resolve the dispute.
Yeah, so Grove Construction initiated 2 attempts at adjudication.
Okay.
For those unfamiliar, adjudication is a quicker method of resolving disputes in construction than going through a full court process.
Right.
The first adjudicator declined to take the case. They cited jurisdictional issues, essentially questioning whether they had the authority to make a ruling.
Right.
However, the second attempt did proceed.
Okay.
And the adjudicator ruled in favor of Grove Construction, ordering Bagshot Manor Limited to pay.
But even with this ruling in their favor, Bagshot Manor Limited still hasn't paid up.
Right.
And that's what led Grove Construction to seek a summary judgment from the court.
Yep.
So for our listeners, think of a summary judgment as like a fast-track decision, where one party says the case is so clear-cut, it doesn't need a full trial.
That's right.
Grove Construction's argument was that Bagshot Manor Limited had stepped into the shoes of BMDL and was liable for the money.
Exactly.
Okay.
Grove Construction's application for this summary judgment rested on the idea that Bagshot Manor had inherited all of BMDL's obligations along with the rights.
Right.
But Bagshot Manor fought back with their own arguments.
So?
They said that the adjudicator never actually had jurisdiction to make the ruling because there was no contractual relationship between them and Grove Construction that included an agreement to go to adjudication.
Okay.
They also argued that simply receiving an assignment of the contract's benefits didn't automatically mean they had inherited all of BMDL's obligations under the contract.
Okay, so this brings us to the heart of the legal matter here. The fundamental principles of assignment in contract law. What are the key rules that govern this kind of situation?
The bedrock principle, and this is very important in legal terms, is that while you can assign the rights and benefits of a contract to someone else, you cannot assign the burdens, obligations, or liabilities to that same someone without the consent of all the original parties to the contract.
Right.
This process of transferring the entire relationship with agreement from everyone is known as novation.
Right. And the judgment references some other important legal cases to support this principle, right?
Yes.
Bexhill, UL, LTD v. Razak is mentioned in this.
Yeah. Bexhill is cited to support this specific point.
Okay.
That a simple assignment doesn't make the assignee a party to the original contract in a way that automatically takes on the obligations.
Right.
Unless there's a novation agreement.
Okay.
And Grove Construction wasn't arguing that novation had happened.
Right.
Between them, BMDL, and Bagshot Manor Limited.
Okay. And what about Energy Works, Hull, VMW high-tech projects? What did that add to our understanding of contract assignment?
That case clarified that when parties refer to the assignment of a contract, it generally means, in legal terms, the assignment of the benefit. So that's the accrued rights that have already happened and the future rights that might arise. It reinforces the idea that you don't automatically inherit the responsibilities unless it's explicitly agreed, like through novation, which requires that consent from all sides.
So Bagshot Manor Limited is saying, we were assigned the potential upside, the benefits, but not the debts or responsibilities.
Exactly.
What were their specific arguments against paying Grove Construction and against the adjudicator having jurisdiction?
Okay, so their legal argument was that the deed of assignment was a standard assignment of benefits.
Okay.
They received BMDL's potential rights under the contract, but that didn't transfer BMDL's obligation to pay.
Okay.
They also argued that Grove Construction's rights of action against BMDL, so for example, the right to sue, couldn't just be assigned over.
Right.
Furthermore, they argued that the clause in the deed about giving notice was simply a new obligation. It required them to inform Grove Construction about the assignment. It didn't create a deeper link where they had to take on all of BMDL's financial responsibilities.
And Grove Construction. Their arguments were a bit tortuous, as the judge put it. What was their reasoning in arguing that Bagshot Manor was liable?
Grove Construction attempted to argue that the description of the assignment as being of construction documents should be interpreted broadly to include the responsibility of defending any claims.
Interesting.
They also tried to leverage Clause 4, the notice clause, saying it created a new obligation for Bagshot Manor directly under the original contract to be responsible for the payments.
So they were trying to imply a transfer of obligations based on the wording, even though there was no specific statement that that was happening. And the judgment mentions that Grove Construction pointed to a clause in the original construction contract itself. Clause 7.1, which dealt with the employer's right to assign the contract. How did they try to use that to support their case?
They highlighted that Clause 7.1 allowed the employer, which was BMDL, to assign its entire rights under the contract without needing Grove Construction's consent. This right to assign was specifically for a company providing finance. Grove Construction seemed to be arguing that Bagshot Manor somehow fell into this category.
Interesting.
And that this clause, therefore, meant a broader transfer of responsibilities had happened.
Including the obligation to pay? However,
the point is that even this clause in the original contract only talks about the assignment of the employer's rights, not the transfer of their obligations. Those remain legally distinct without novation.
So even if that clause applied, it still doesn't mean Bagshot Manor had to pay Grove Construction.
That's right.
So after considering all of these arguments, what was the court's decision?
The district judge sided with Bagshot Manor Limited. The decision was that the adjudicator lacked the jurisdiction to make a ruling. Because there was no direct contractual link between Grove Construction and Bagshot Manor. That included an agreement to go to adjudication. So the court dismissed Grove Construction's application for summary judgment and granted Bagshot Manor a declaration stating that they did not inherit BMDL's obligations.
And what was the judge's reasoning?
The judge emphasized the importance of reading the deed of assignment. He found that the clear intention was to transfer BMDL's benefits, the potential rights to receive something, not to impose BMDL's burdens and obligations. He said that trying to interpret the assignment of rights of action as including the transfer of payment obligations would be impermissible. Basically, you can't sneak in the responsibility to pay through a general assignment of rights.
And what about Clause 4? The notice clause that Grove Construction had tried to use?
The judge saw that clause as just setting out a way of giving notice to the relevant parties, making sure the process was consistent with what was in the original contract. In his view, it didn't create any new obligations for Bagshot Manor.
Particularly not the obligation to make payments.
Exactly.
So the judge stuck to the wording and the legal principles of contract assignment. He also touched on the fact that Grove Construction's original contract was with BMDL. And a dispute with Bagshot Manor, who were the assignees, isn't automatically a dispute under the contract for adjudication in this context.
That's right. The judge highlighted that Grove Construction's rights for payment remained against BMDL. The insolvency of BMDL was characterized as a hazard of contracting, something that businesses need to be aware of. He said that parties can negotiate protections against this, as was evidenced by the inclusion of clauses 7.1 and 7.2 in the original agreement in this case.
So a very clear message about the importance of formal agreements and the distinction between assigning rights and transferring obligations. What's the key takeaway for our listener from this?
The takeaway is this. When a contract is assigned, that assignment generally only transfers the benefits and rights. It does not automatically transfer the obligations to the new party unless there is a separate and explicit novation agreement in place, where all the original parties consent to the transfer of the entire contract. This case really highlights the implications this has for determining who's liable and who can start legal actions if there's a dispute.
It highlights how important it is to define the scope of any assignment agreement. What seem like small details can actually have very significant consequences when disputes arise.
Absolutely. The specific language used in these agreements matters. It dictates the relationships and responsibilities.
This case is a reminder of that.
That's right.